Hello and welcome to another painting session here with me, Phelim from Brushstrokes Art School. It's another beautiful morning here. You can see the sunlight is bursting through the window, and for today's lesson I thought I would do something similar to that which I did the last day, which was a loose landscape painting. Today I thought I would do a loose seascape and in knife for a change, because knife painting is one of those things that comes up quite regularly as something that people are curious about and interested in, and always wondering how you use a knife and how would one work with the idea of a knife painting. The most common mistake I find when people want to learn to paint with knife that they tend to make is that they try to use a knife the way they would a brush. And of course the key to working with a knife is to allow the freedom of the knife to take its own part in the painting. That is to say, don't try and control it too much. Allow it and give over to the freedom of the knife. So more so than anything else, you're working in a very loose and suggestive fashion rather than in an exact and defined fashion. Now, the subject that I'm going to work with today is one of Keel Strand in County Mayo, and what I like about this particular subject is you can see it has distant mountains, middle ground sea, and then foreground rocks. So it has a lovely sense of that idea of background, middle ground and foreground, so I can get to grips with the idea of showing a sense of depth and perspective in what you're doing. It is quite a sunny day, but there's quite a few clouds in it as well, so it gives us a lovely opportunity to paint the idea of the clouds and the light, and then how these lights and darks reflect into the water, and then the lights and darks onto the rocks themselves. Now, what I'm using today is I'm going to use this to do an outline drawing, because the key to painting with knife, as far as I'm concerned, is making sure that your underdrawing and underpainting is very, very good, and that you've defined your quality of lights and darks in your underpainting as clearly as possible, because that facilitates the freedom. If your drawing is poor, if your drawing is limited, then you will try and make up for that with the knife. The problem with that is that you can oftentimes put in too much paint or try to put in too much detail, and then the whole thing, especially with a lot of paint on the surface, a lot of texture, becomes very messy very quickly, and you feel a sense of inability to control the paint, and then the risk is that it turns to mush. Whereas if you have a very good drawing and a very good underpainting, you have much more clear defined qualities and lines and boundaries and shapes that you can work within, in both in your lights, your mediums and your darks. So it helps you to simplify by making sure that your drawing and your underpainting are good. For my knives, I normally work with 3 knives. I normally have a long knife, a triangular short knife, and then a very small one for the little details. But unfortunately, as we're all in lockdown, I don't have all of my equipment here. I'm working from home, so I only have a very limited range of equipment. Most of my stuff would be in the studio, so I'm simply going to work with this one, and it's perfectly possible to do so. And I'll show you how. For example, with the details, I'll work with only the top section of the knife rather than trying to employ the whole thing. Essentially, with the knife, there are 3 elements and 3 ways in which you would use it. You have the flat space, the flat face of the knife, the full flat face of the knife, you have the blade edge, and you have the tip. These are the 3 elements that are the 3 portions that are most useful and most used when you're painting with the knife, and that's what you'll be working with here. Now, as you can see, I've done out a very loose little pencil sketch just to save a bit of time. And now I'm going to just go back over that with a very clear, very simple white spirit wash, if you like. So I'm going to take a little bit of white spirits, and I'm going to take a little bit of my cobalt blue, and as before, just to go through my colours, I have titanium white, chrome yellow, cadmium red, permanent rose, phthalo blue, cobalt blue, cerulean blue, and burnt umber, and that's what I'll be using into this painting today. Now, taking a little bit of the idea of the cobalt blue with a small amount of white spirits, I'm simply going to use a pale blue into the background, so I'm just going to go back over these spaces very quickly and very easily. Now, for the purposes of my knife painting, as I said, my drawing needs to be very good, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same as that, and I've mentioned that several times in my demonstration. When you're painting, you're not necessarily creating a photograph. It's different if you're working with a portrait or even a figurative scene, but particularly a portrait where it has to look like the person. When it comes to landscapes and seascapes, it's entirely up to you to interpret and play with the shapes and forms that you see, not alone in structure but also in colour. So bear that in mind, that you don't have to be too rigid and too perfect. Now, I've chosen to do just a soft background blue as here on the mountain. As you can see, it blends in on top of the pencil, creating a slightly grey effect. Now, that'll smudge somewhat while it's wet, but once it dries, it doesn't smudge anymore. I'm going to take a little bit of my darker phthalo blue, and I'm going to add to a little bit of burnt umber, and again a little bit of white spirits, and I'm going to use that for the rocks that I have outlined loosely in the foreground. So I'm just going to go back over those, and I want here to achieve a sense of the outline of this rocky face here. So you can see all these stones with all the lovely seaweed and mossy greens and on the surface, and I want to try and capture that. So the tide is out in this situation here, and that's what I liked about it, was that we got not only just the idea of background, middle ground and foreground, but also got some of the idea of the foreground strength and drama with the rocks and some of the water and the reflections. So you got a lovely sense of drama. It's a composition that I think it adds a lot of playfulness into the opportunities with your paint that you can utilise. Now I'm just expressing, I've already put in the outline very loosely and very softly, so before I go back into starting with the knife, I'm going to just put in a few extra strokes of darkness using my burnt umber, my phthalo blue, just to give a little bit more depth here and there before we start defining much more clarity, much more feeling in terms of the structures with the knife. So it helps to give a greater sense of perspective when you can see the foreground with greater clarity and depth, and then allow everything else to move away and become a little bit softer as it progresses further back, or recesses if you like, further back. Now, as I said, once I understand the quality of my outlines and my lights and darks, then I'm ready to start working in with the knife. Now, I can start with the sky or I can start with the mountains, whichever I prefer. There's no right or wrong place. I have talked to you before about the idea of starting with the elements, as in the mountains and the rocks in the foreground. But in this case, I think it would be quite useful to maybe maintain a little bit of overall sense of freedom. As I said, when I'm painting, I don't always know exactly what I want to achieve. I don't always know exactly the direction I'm going to take. I need only know the next step and have an idea of what I'm looking for at the end, so that it allows for the journey and the sense of playfulness and the sense of uncertainty. And that's what I like. One of the things I like about painting is that sense of surprise, that sense of not quite sure what you're going to do into the next step. So we have a blue sky, and when you have a blue sky, that feeling of blue has to be pervasive onto everything below it. So regardless of what's below it, whether it's landscape, whether it's seascape, whether it's buildings, that feeling of blue has to reflect down on top of everything, and so it has to be a great sense of influence. And when you apply sunshine into that, it brings a great deal of warmth. So oftentimes your colours in the background particularly will have this wonderful sense of warm blue or even violets to show through, and that helps to convey the feeling of not just sunlight but also warmth coming through. And you can see that here in my mountain in the background. There is that lovely sense of soft violet. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit of white first. I'm going to mix it in here with the little bit of washed colour that I had. You can see it's bringing up a soft grey because I don't want it to be too heavy. I'm going to take a little bit more cobalt blue and I'm going to add to that a touch of my permanent rose. One of the things I love about knife painting is the freedom and the cleanliness. I love the sharpness of the knife. I love the immediacy of it. And so when you're trying to paint with knife, think about it. When I was talking about the loose free landscape, I was saying to you about how it's important to do a little bit of prep work beforehand so that you know how much to leave out as much as how much to put in. And knife painting is no different. It's very important that you have a sense of what you're putting in, but equally and sometimes more important to understand, what am I leaving out? How much do I need to put in to get the effects that I'm looking for? How much do I need to leave out in order to maintain a certain simplicity in what I'm doing? So be wary of that when you're painting. So take the time when you're considering your composition to look through it, to ask yourself questions, to become aware and familiar with the lights and the mediums and the darks, the general structures, the background, the middle ground, the foreground, and decide how much of what's there you're putting in, how much you're leaving out, and have an idea of that when you start to paint. So with this, strengthen that up again, a little bit more blue. And a touch of phthalo blue into that, just to give a little bit more depth. Now, of course, the colours can be tailored as I go along. I'm going to take this, I'm just going to let that, it's a bit too blue, so I'm going to bring a little bit more red into that. Give it slightly more violet colouring. Now, the one thing you will discover when you're painting with knife is that you will use an awful lot more paint than you do when you're working with a brush. So be wary of that and be prepared for that. So just coming in, I'm working in a downward fashion. I'm just filling in the spaces. Now, as you notice, I have a pink wash on my canvas, and I did that purposely because I wanted something very warm and very vibrant. And so I'm going to allow little traces of pink to show through sporadically throughout the canvas to add a little bit more playfulness. And adding in a playful underwash colour is a really fun and easy way to experiment with colours without feeling you have to be too dramatic in the colours themselves. You can just allow a little bit of that underlying wash to come through. Now, as we move across, there's a second headland, and it has a little touch of greenery to it. So I'm going to add in a wee bit of green into this now, just to show that, give a little bit more shaping into that space. So I've put that in for now. The mountain behind is slightly more distant, so as a consequence slightly paler. This one here, this headland in the front, is a little bit more closer to us, so we see if we can perceive a little bit of greenery coming through into that space. So what I'm going to do first is take a little bit more white, and using a slightly paler colour, and using the tip of the knife this time just to get into these smaller spaces, too white. I'm going to just come in and fill in these ideas here. Now while I'm looking at detail in the photograph, as I said to you, I'm purposely trying to maintain a sense of less is more. So I'm referring to this, but I'm not copying it photographically. So I'm taking my reference, I'm taking my influence, but I'm putting my own stamp onto it. Now I'm going to take a little bit of my chrome yellow in here, bringing in that influence of green, and I'm going to paint that in for this headland here. And I haven't mixed it perfectly onto the colour here or onto my knife, so there's little bits of the blue coming through and the violet, which I purposely want. So there's a slightly uneven feeling into the colour mix, which again helps to convey a sense of distance and confusion. It doesn't have to be absolute, because I cannot make out every single detail that's on the background, so nor do I need to paint it as it is. So just put in little bits of that there. And again, I'm working in a vertical fashion just for the feeling of that distance into that space. Now I'm going to take a little bit more of my violet, so I'll touch a red into that. And I'm going to bring that in here and there into the background with little bits of the green, so that even in the mountain in the background there's little bits of the blue where the light from the sky is hitting off, and so portions of the greenery of the landscape is visible to us. And I'm going to take a little bit of white and hit that occasionally as well for the same feeling. And similarly, taking a touch of my phthalo blue, a touch of my permanent rose, and with a nice dark violet, putting in little bits of that here and there as well. I'm not trying to finish every portion of this as I go, because what you're currently doing has yet to be influenced by what you've not yet done. So nothing is ever finished until everything is finished. So I put in what I think is okay for now, but I will go back and I'll assess it and I'll define it as I go forward, depending on other elements that I add in. Now this, as you can see, is a bit too strong, so I'm going to soften that down a little. Just blend that down into the paint. And this is where knife painting is wonderful, because it's so heavy and textured and wet. It's a great opportunity to just immediately come in and blend down and create shapes and forms without being too perfect. And the blue in the background helps to convey that sense of distance a little bit more clearly. Just there. Now there is another little island here in the foreground which has a little bit more strength yet again, a little bit more definition, so I'm going to put that in. Once again, just using the tip of the knife, just to get that, and towards the bottom of it I'm seeing just a little bit of that violet representing the cliff face of the stones of the rocks at the edge of the island itself. Now, I think I'll just shape this up a little here to give a little bit more softness into it. Now, cleaning off my knife, I'm going to take a little bit of the cadmium red, a little bit of white, and I'm bringing in little bits of that pinkiness here and there just to soften down those violets. There is a suggestion of houses on this area back here, so I'm going to just put in little bits of white here and there just to suggest that idea. But once again, I can't see those accurately, so all I want is just a very vague suggestion of there being buildings or houses or other things on the background landmass. Now from there, I'm going to leave that alone for the moment, and I'm going to come in, I'm going to come back in with a very the greeny colour. I'm going to take this green violet, going to mix all of this up together here, and I'm going to use a little bit more chrome yellow and a little bit of my cerulean blue, which is slid down the canvas. Because I leave my palette vertically up, everything slides down because of the oil in the paint, so I have to be wary of that. And I'm going to start suggesting here on the rocks in the foreground areas where these greens show through. Now, as I said to you, there's three areas to use on the knife. There's the entire face itself, or there's the top triangular section, or the blade. For now, for this, I want to work more with the top triangular section. So I'm just going to take paint on the top of that and just manipulate that into these spaces. And for the moment, I'm going to allow some of my outlines to remain visible. I can eliminate them at any stage, but for now they help me just give a sense of understanding to the shapes and forms that I'm looking at. Now, having laid in some of my greens, I'm now going to come in and introduce some of the middle range colours, the violets, the darker violets. So again, cleaning off my knife, coming in with some of my phthalo blue, my permanent rose, small amount of white. I can use a small amount of burnt umber into that as well. Now I'm purposely moving more towards a violet influence for my darks rather than a black or brown, because I want to do two things. One is I want to very dramatically influence the effect, replicate the effect of the blue from the sky coming down and defining a sense of warmth into those shadows. And two, it's a more interesting colour than the browns and blacks for me, and I prefer to use that as my darker colour. So I'm just going to come in and put in little traces of that here and there. Now again, remember, the aim is to maintain a sense of freedom, not to get too locked into trying to be too detailed. So less is more. Always have that in your mind as you're painting. Now, as you can see, I'm just sporadically adding in touches of dark. I'm not trying to be too perfect. I'm not trying to be too rigid. I'm not trying to be too detailed. I'm just trying to get a sense of where I feel those darks sit and just apply a little bit of colour for them, with the intention, as I said, if necessary, of coming back in later on and adding more definition and detail into those spaces. Within reason, of course. As I said, the whole idea is not to be too defined and too detailed. Take a little bit of chrome yellow with that again and come up with a dark green. So using that foundation base of the blue and the red, adding a little bit of yellow and coming up with a dark green, adding in touches of the dark greens into these spaces as well. Now, bearing in mind that the water will have a huge impact in terms of shaping up these, so I'm purposely painting in the, as I said, the positive space of the mountain and the rocks in the foreground, and then when I bring the sky and the water back around these, I'll have to pull those out and create a bit of definition. The principle being that if, for example, let's say I was painting this jar, if I paint my background flat and then I just paint this jar in on top of the background, the risk is that it can look still quite two-dimensional, because I'm painting the jar once from the inside out onto the background. However, if I paint my jar first, I've painted once from the inside out to define the lines on the canvas, but then when I bring my background in and around that, I'm coming in a second time from the outside in, and having to go around the outline a second time from the outside in is what helps to give a greater sense of feeling, depth and three-dimensionality to it in a much more defined fashion. And that's the similar technique that I've used throughout the demonstrations I've done here on the channel for you, and as also I'm doing it with this here. Just little touches. Now this rocky area here seems to have a lot more middle and light grey showing through, so I'm just going to again wipe off the knife and come in with a little bit of that feeling of greyishness. So just down here on this side, once more a little bit of blue and red, touch of my green to make it grey. So the violet with the green, as you can see, it's starting to give it a little bit of warmth and softness as a grey. I'm just going to put in little bits of that here and there. So you can see there's very little waste in terms of the paint if you understand and utilise your colours well. Bring that in. And you can see there's still quite a lot of the pink underpainting coming through, and at the moment that doesn't always make sense because there's still so much it's still showing on the sky and the water, but when I utilise those backgrounds more effectively, it'll help to convey more drama and playfulness onto the spaces where I have left the little touches of the grey showing through. Now I'm going to leave the stones there in the foreground for now, the rocks in the foreground, and I'm now going to do a little bit of work into my sky. And as before, I will always start with my clouds. Now with my white and a small touch of the pinky yellow I've just mixed up using the cadmium red and the chrome yellow, I'm going to put in this cloudy effect over the surface of the mountain. Now I need to keep it separate for the moment, so I don't want to touch off the mountain just as yet, otherwise it'll blend with my blue and I'll end up with an off-white colour rather than the purity of that I'm looking for. And I'm just tapping in using the flat face of the knife to get that effect for the moment, because where the edges can work in terms of the mountains and the rocks in the foreground, I don't want edges on my sky or onto my clouds because they don't have edges. So once I get that light in, then I can start to bring it down and just let it touch off the surface of the mountains, get that wonderful muted wispiness of the clouds just coming down over the surface of the mountain. And in doing so, they disguise the line of the mountain so it's not quite so crisp and it's not quite so clear. Now from there, behind that, I have a flatter space of the pinky yellowish tone coming in and it's giving this lovely linear shaping coming across the sky. from the lower areas here on the left hand side in the distant horizon through to the areas behind the mountains. And again, I want to keep these clean, so it's very important that you separate your colours. So where you have your lights, your mediums and your darks, make sure to apply them as much as you can separately so that they don't interfere with one another until such time as you wish them to. So you can put in your mediums and your darks and then finally your lights, and where they meet you can blend them together and soften them either with the knife, or if necessary use a brush. There's no rule against using a brush if you find it too difficult to use the knife to get that sort of definition. Now just up around the edges, the shape of the mountain, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious just to try and pull out the shape of that a little bit more clearly. Once again, not feeling that I have to be too rigid in terms of the accuracy that I'm looking at, because this is my interpretation of this space. Now where I want definition on the mountain, I can let the knife, just use the blade of the knife just to touch up against that edge and just to sharpen that line a little bit more without being too broken or too rigid. Now using the face of the knife, just flapping in a little bit of long flat colour just with the idea of these beautiful floating clouds that we see here in the background. Now again, I'm just using the blade, the flat of the knife, just to pull the colour down here to keep a little bit more simplicity on the horizon space, and that helps give a little bit more distance as well as give me a lovely sharp line along my horizon at that point through. Now I'm going to come in with my blue, and I need to just clean off a space because I want the blue to be quite pure, and the palette is a little bit dirty at this stage, so I'm going to take my knife and take out some of those colours there and just clean it up a little before I go back into that again. Now with my white and a little bit of my cerulean blue, mix up a nice soft blue, and I'm going to use that very gently just down towards the bottom portion of the sky here. So the lower portion of the sky is always going to be brighter and lighter than the nearer parts to you. So if you can imagine the idea of the horizon in the sky, which is further away from you, that as it rises up goes from the light towards the horizon, and as it moves up it gets darker, 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 culminating in a stronger blue directly above you here. So as you paint your graduated skies, paler, getting darker and getting darker, and you can see that here it's pale, and as it moves up it gets a little bit darker. So for that feeling of luminosity and distance, I'm bringing this lovely light blue, just softening it into these spaces here, and I'll put a little bit of it as a beginning of the blue into this space, but I'm going to strengthen my blue here for that same purpose as I've just described. And there's a lovely muted warmth about that blue which I like into that space there. Now I'll add a little bit more cobalt into that space, that colour that I had. So I've already had cerulean and white. Now putting a little bit more cerulean and cobalt with my white into that just to warm that colour up a little. Now flattening out with the face of the knife, just getting that lovely flatness into that space, and the same here, and then working it vertically just to soften that down a little. Cleaning off the knife, I want to go back and just clean up where I've eaten into the idea of the cloud colours a little bit too much, and just scraping off some of the blue over those spaces and just blending it down here a little bit more into those areas there. And again here where they meet, I just need a little bit of softness, so from the light on up into the blue, and keep wiping off so I'm not bringing too much of the blue down. Just bring that up into that space. Now just touching up on some of my pale colours here, get a little bit more of that vibrancy back in, where the blue overtook just a wee bit too much into that space on me. So I'm just touching up on those to give a little bit more softness into that space, into my sky. Get a little bit more drama, and every now and then stepping back just to get a feeling for what it is you're doing, because if we stand too close or we sit too close to the easel or the painting, it's hard to get a sense of understanding what we're doing. Stepping back allows you to see all the elements coming together much more effectively, and you can get a feeling as to whether or not they're working or you need to make adjustments as you go along. I'm going to just let some of my clouds just eat down a little bit more into that space, and there are some highlights of pure light on that, so I'm going to make sure my knife is clean with some pure titanium white, and quite heavily I'm just going to come in and layer in a few touches of brightness, hitting off that to give the impression of the brighter cloud highlights just sitting on that space there, separate to the slightly floater clouds that sit above it. Now, okay, using the same techniques, I'm now going to come in and apply some colour into the water. Now you can see the horizon is quite dark. Oftentimes horizon lines will be quite strong, but be very careful not to overdo the line insofar as being too rigid, because it makes it too harsh and brings your foreground, or rather your background, too much into the foreground and you can lose your sense of distance and perspective. Equally, as a consequence of that feeling of distance, the perspective is defined by the softness of colour. So while it can be strong, it's not always rigidly harsh. So while the colour here along the horizon is stronger than it is here in the foreground, it's not overly dark. So be careful not to make it too heavy-handed or too dark. While I have this light blue, I'm going to put some of that into the middle area here. And there are some waves that flow through here. So you can see these waves just coming in. And I will pick up on those, but there's an overhang of shadow that comes from the landscape down onto the water, so you can see it's not terribly bright into this space. And I'm going to just put in a little bit of this idea of the soft blue into the middle. Now what I like about this composition is the way the light colours on the blues in the water really shape out the shaping of the rocks here in the foreground, and then the softer damp strand, you have traces of the greys and violets and blues into that space. Now again, you've just got to be careful just to work around these spaces quite carefully, not to fill them up too much. With my phthalo blue, a little bit of this pinky colour I had already, I'm going to mix this up as my background colour along the horizon. Now I need my horizon to stand out and to shape up the landscape a little bit more. Now I'm using, just as you can see, I have colour just along the edge of the knife here, just along the blade of the knife there, and I'll use that just running across for the idea of the horizon. Doesn't have to be too perfect, doesn't have to be absolute, just well enough to give a subtle difference between it and the background. Now, a slightly paler version of that, and I'm going to let that sit here into my foreground. As you can see, the colour is a little bit bolder. Now, there's a part of me likes the idea of letting some of my foreground, where I have the rocks and the water meeting, there's a part of me likes the idea of just letting those merge together and not being too defined about the outline, insofar as conveying a slightly watery effect to it. So at the moment, I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to treat this. I'm going to put some colour in and, just judging by eye and feeling, decide exactly how I'm going to allow these to work and manifest together in terms of the shapes and the forms and the colours, to give an effect of the idea of the foreground. Now, as you can see, there's some beautiful light here just running through the right hand side, reflecting from this vibrancy of light coming from this area of the clouds and the sky. So that is being reflected down onto the right hand side here. So for that, I'm taking some of the cadmium red, white, mixing into the blue that I already had, and I'm creating this slightly tonal feeling of soft bluey colouring just to apply into this space here. Now just fill that in, leaving as before traces of the pink coming through. Now you do have to be quite careful, so even though you're working with a knife, you can't just go gung-ho and just put it everywhere. There still has to be a sense of control. So free painting, free loose painting, whether it's with the brush or whether it's with the knife, is all about control, believe it or not. So if you're too loose and free, while it can be very evocative and create a sense of drama and atmosphere, it can also very quickly fall away and become very uncontrolled and very poorly done. Knowing when to be loose and when to have that sense of freedom with your brush or with your knife is something that time and experimentation and experience will teach you. But if you do it at the wrong time, your painting can fall apart very quickly. So in a situation such as this, where we have a certain complexity of shape between the horizon line and the stones and rocks and the water, I need to have a certain definition and control about making sure that the background negative space of the water shows out the rocks. So I don't want to be too brash or too gung-ho. So a certain amount of patience and time is necessary in spaces like this to get the sense of form and focus that you're looking for, working around the space just to make sure you get that shaping. So in these situations, take your time. Now, as you can see, I've quite well covered in the space with the water, and I've put in a flat feeling of the colours. Generally the softer, stronger the stronger colours into the background, but with a certain degree of softness so that the horizon line is not too strong, not too overtaking. Letting some of the soft colours just drift through that to soften it down. This beautiful lighter colour that sits into the middle of the water, and then getting slightly stronger as we come into the shallow space in the foreground where we don't have that depth of water to reflect the light. And so we're seeing through the little bit of shallow water into the colour of the sand, and I'll bring in some of those violets and greys later on. I just wanted to get the blues in for the moment. Now, I'm going to just take a moment just to look at it, and as I do, I can see that my rocks in the foreground, I've left quite a lot of pinks coming through, and I've only sporadically put in the darks and the greens, so there's still quite quite a lot of lightness or softness about them, and I need, when you look at the photograph, you can see the foreground rocks are quite bold and quite strong, so I need to get more of my darks in there to give more strength and depth into it. I need yet to put in a feeling of the waves that come across the middle of the water area here from this rock on the right or on the left hand side, and I need to exaggerate some of the dark reflections here as part of the movement and some of the lights. So they're the things that I need to look at. I see also that there's a little bit more of my blue coming down the sky. I may well come back in and do that, but for now I'm going to focus on the rocks in the foreground, getting that little bit of extra strength into them before I do anything else, and see how that goes. As part of that, I'm going to simply take the darks I have and start moving them down into the spaces. So I'm going to let some of my greens and my darks merge here to get an overall feeling of darkness or weight into that, because it is predominantly the darks that will create the feeling of volume into this space at this point in time. So just moving the knife around left and right, creating that feeling of a little bit more filled in space. You can see I've left quite a lot of the pink underlying colour still in the sky, still in the water, and as I already said with this, the rocks in the foreground, but perhaps too much with the rocks, so I'm going to just pull those out a little. I'm still looking at the possibility of creating more emergence between the foreground and the water and not having too much definition or separation between them. I'm softening up this background area here, this rocky area, so that there's a little more distance into it. It's not too much into the foreground. So that the foreground colours will be stronger and warmer, the middle ground colours will get weaker, and the background colours much more so they're much more paler and softer. Now there are some reflections you can see here, but there and there, so I'm going to take some of that softness, I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium red into my colour that I have on the palette knife. I'm going to just add a little bit of white into that. I'm going to just use that soft warm grey. I'm going to put that underneath here for the reflection of the rocks to that space, and just cut across it with the blade of the knife to give a feeling of the softness and reflection, and the same here into this space. So starting to introduce some of that sandy colour that I mentioned earlier that we can see coming through the water effect of that space. Now my water in the foreground is somewhat brighter than it is in the photograph, but I quite like it. So I haven't decided yet whether or not I'll dull it down. I'm simply going to work it as it is for the moment and see how it turns out. And that is so much about painting. Painting is an organic process. It's not about knowing everything you need to do. It's about knowing the current step and perhaps the next step and moving towards that, but always keeping an eye on the current step and being willing to go with the flow. So much happens by accident. The technique is recognizing when the accident is working. Now, some accidents are techniques, but they're unknowing techniques, if you like. You're doing them subconsciously. So if you like, you achieve something that you don't always set out to achieve because you intended going in a different direction. Doesn't make it less valid or less technical in that respect. It just happens because it could be something in your head that you're realizing you're working towards. Just bring those down. Now I will try that little touch of stronger blue in the foreground. So I'm taking a little bit of my phthalo blue. Just going to hit it here and there just to see what sort of impact. And it's quite soft. And I'm looking to be quite soft. I don't want to be too heavy-handed with it. And you can see there is a sense of mergence with the colours in the foreground. I like that. I like that little bit of definition. And what I intend to do if I keep that is just to throw in a few darks well placed here and there, just to give the strength that I'm looking for without feeling I have to be too outlined. There's a lovely little bit of the water. There's a triangular space here in the middle where the water's coming in and breaking up that sense of division. So I'm going to take a little bit of cobalt and white. I'm just going to put that into that space as well. So it gives the idea of a little rock pool into that space. I like that. A little bit of touch here. So I'm coming back into that space. The idea of the waves on the outside that we haven't seen much of yet, I might just put a suggestion of those in here. And purposely make them a little bit brighter and whiter to stand out. They are less visible in the photograph, but I'm going to make them stand out a little bit more just for a little bit more drama and playfulness in my middle ground. As you can see, I'm just taking the blade of the knife and just pulling it down with a little bit of pure white. Now the white, as I apply it, merges with the colours that are there, so I'm not getting absolute purity, which is okay because the waves are never pure white, they're never flat. Waves are moving elements, and so as they're moving and uneven, you get lights and darks on them. So if you paint them too dark, they're too flat. If you paint them too light, they're too flat. So it's always a combination of both that you get for more realism. And as part of that, in between the spaces, as waves roll, you have the whitewash areas, but you also have the shadow areas where they've not yet rolled over, or where they have, and you get that sense of dark blue or dark grey coming through. And to that end, I'm going to take a little of my darker blue back in here, And I'm going to use that in the same sort of linear fashion here and there, just to give that suggestion of the waves here and there. So another bit of darkness running through this space, and again I'm using the blade of the brush, the blade of the knife, coming in, just scratching it across for that feeling of linear shaping and a little bit of linear movement in the water. So this is where the water is quite heavy, and it moves onto the beach here, becomes much thinner, so we don't get as much depth into it. And so I'm using the blade to convey that feeling, just of lapping up or washing up onto the strand. I'm going to soften some of those a little bit, so just drying off my knife and just blending them down a tiny touch, so very little pressure on the knife, just to convey that feeling. Now we can take a little bit more light and just into these spaces bring it down to create a little bit more brightness from the clouds. Now actually that colour should be slightly warmer, so I'll go back over to my pinks here. I'll take a moment. The palette once again is getting very dirty, so I need to be a little bit brighter and cleaner, so I'm going to take some of these, move them up. So once more I'm going to take some white, tiny touch of the cadmium red, tiny touch of the chrome yellow. As you can see, it's very potent. Take some of this and just let it come in here and there, just to give a little bit more drama, and you can see it picks up a beautiful feeling of light. I like that a lot. And again, I'm working vertically, top to bottom, to give a feeling of calmness. When you work from left to right, when you create lines, there's a sense of movement. When you work from top to bottom, you get a feeling of a vertical form, or oftentimes in situations such as this, of just calmness, nothing moving. And just have a point. Don't run it all the way across, because if I run it all the way across, it dilutes the impact and the drama. If I keep it contained into one area, it has much more definition and much more focal quality about it. I can put a little bit of that just onto the top of the waves there. And I said we already have it up here onto this area. And I will also take a tiny touch of my brighter colours, and I'm going to hit here and there little bits of that light onto the landscapes, just suggesting the idea of sunlight just clipping off those spaces there. I can do the same again with this area of stone and rock in the foreground. Now, I still yet have not resolved the idea of the darks here, so I need to go back in and get a little bit more definition on that before I decide on anything else, before I go back to the background. So I'm coming back in with my burnt umber, my phthalo blue and my permanent rose. In fact, I'm going to mix all my blues in there for the moment, just to use them up, and yet they still give me quite a dark colour between them, in tandem with the burnt umber and the permanent rose. I'm just going to get a little bit more. You can see the darks coming across here, so just going to pick up on these much more dramatically now. Now, just about added in a little bit more of those darks, so you can see there's a greater feeling of strength into my foreground, but again, at the same time, I'm conscious that I don't want to overdo it or make it too defined and too heavy-handed, so I'll leave my darks well enough for now, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to bring in a consequential light to add in a balancing form to those darks. You can see as well that the rocks here in this area are quite bold and quite strong, they stand out, whereas here they are softer and they merge into the sand and into the water, so we don't need to be too rigid into those spaces there. Now I'm going to just see this area here could be a little bit more lit, so I'm going to take a little bit of my chrome yellow once again, touch my light colour, and a little bit of my phthalo blue, softer yellowy green just here and there, just to give a little bit of counterbalance, especially on the flatter spaces, so where the light comes down and hits those, and just tapping in. Don't have to be too perfect, it's all intended purely to give the impression of the unevenness on the surface of these rocks covered in seaweed and sea moss, etc. Taking this way, because I'm right-handed, sometimes it's easier just to get the shapes and the angles with your other hand, so just taking my left hand, the knife just hitting in. As I said, this area merges with the water, so I don't want to be too perfect with that. Once again, a little bit more brightness, and over here hitting it. Like so. I like that. I like the way that just jumps out without being too perfect and too rigid into that space. Just chop in with the knife here and there, little bits of gentle chopping in, just to create just commode that sense of evenness into those spaces. There's a little bit onto this one here and there. Now, okay, I'm just going to go back to my sky for a moment. We're nearly there. I'm going to go back to my sky and I'm going to just pull some of the blue down a little here. So I'm going to take some of the blue I have up here, just going to pull that in and just create a little bit more softness and separation in between those spaces there. Let that come up with a little bit more unevenness. So again, I dry off the knife in between these spaces because I don't want to take too much of the blue down. And if I don't dry off my knife, I'm just really just pulling the blue down into the lovely light colour that I have down here, which I don't want to do that. Soften up here as well. You can see there's little bits of time spent just tipping and tapping just to find your balance in the overall sense of colour that you've got. Just taking the flat of the knife and just bringing it across to even that out a little bit more, so that the clouds have a slightly more defined quality through their texture as a contrast. Now that cloud moves up a little, I think I'll take a little more of my pinky colour here and just play a little bit more in there, like just to give a little bit more playfulness and depth into that space, while I have that same brightness. Going back to what we were doing earlier on, just touching in one or two little touches along this space, so back here. And I'm just chopping in with the blade of the knife just to get that feeling of soft movement into those spaces. And while I'm not using quite the same amount of brightness I have here on the right, over on the left I'm just going to brighten up a little bit more with a tiny touch of my brighter blue, just again to pull that out from the rocks, give a little bit more depth into those spaces. Now, to give a little bit more emphasis to my background, I'm going to mix up a slightly darker blue, and just across the horizon just on the right hand side I'm going to strengthen up that colour a little, get a little bit more depth into that space. It feels a bit weak, and this just helps to give a little bit more strength. And just one or two last minute touches just with my darks, just to make sure I'm happy with the depth in those. Some of the red is coming through quite boldly, and actually I quite like that. This is where, again, oftentimes when I want to create a little bit more drama in my paintings, I'll add tiny touches of cadmium red or vibrant greens or vibrant blues just here and there to give a little bit of oomph to that part of the painting. And quite by accident, touches of the reds and blues have just shown through there because the paint wasn't mixed quite perfectly on my knife, and it's come out quite well. I like that, so I'm going to actually leave that and introduce it elsewhere, just for a bit of playfulness into the composition. And that, it's a nice way of displaying what I was talking about earlier on, the idea of happy accidents that we don't anticipate or expect. Now, take a moment just to have a wee look and make sure I'm happy, and I think that little island in the background is a bit too heavy handed. I'm going to soften this down. And so that brings me to the end of my knife painting demonstration of a seascape. I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I hope you gained some insights into the idea of painting with a knife. Remember just the few tips that I gave you insofar as, one, make sure that your drawing is very good, make sure that your underpainting is very good, because both of those things free you up with the knife, that you don't feel you have to make too many perfect lines and perfect marks. Give over to the knife its freedom, so especially in the big broad spaces such as the sky and the water, be loose, allow the flat of the knife to work for you. Even though you see lots and lots of detail, don't feel compelled to put it all in. Remember, so much of it is about how much you leave in as much as how much you leave out. So be wary of that. Don't be afraid to suggest to be bolder or livelier with your colours. Don't be afraid to leave things sit slightly differently. Be wary of haphazard or accident. It's so much thing, as I said, of what we do happens by accident, utilising that. You can see I left plenty of my underlying wash, and I was saying to you that one of the fun ways to play with colour is to put on a colour wash that you wouldn't normally use, like a bright orange, a bright green, a bright blue, or in this case a bright pink. It comes through, creates a sense of freedom and playfulness as you go along. In the meantime, have some fun with your painting adventures. Give the knife a go if you have one. If not, continue painting freely with your brushes, and I will look forward to seeing you again in a few days with another painting demonstration, or perhaps a drawing demonstration. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now. Bye.